Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to David Daoud of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies about the likelihood of a full-blown war between Israel and Hezbollah. Then we'll discuss the recent hack of the federal government's own anti-hacking arm, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And then we'll also dive into whether the U.S. and its allies have built a drone bubble that's about to burst. As some military officials warn, these small unmanned aircraft could soon lose their advantage on the battlefield. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I am joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. We have a deep dive coming up here on the show about the possibility of an all-out Israel-Hezbollah war and the potential devastation that could bring to Israel, Lebanon, and potentially the entire Middle East. But before we get to that, as always, Guy, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It is great to be here as always. One development I want to highlight right now involves cyber threats and hacking by foreign adversaries. Somewhat amazingly, the U.S. federal government's premier anti-hacking agency, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, has revealed that its own systems were breached by hackers earlier this year in what appears to have been a foreign espionage operation against the United States. This revelation has sent shockwaves through the U.S. intelligence community, but outside of a few trade publications, it's barely drawn the attention of the mainstream media, and there are a slew of questions about what actually happened. CISA says the hacking happened in January of this year, so 6 months ago. Why it took until now for the agency to reveal it is one of the big questions. CISA says the hackers were trying to steal secretive details about how the U.S. government collects information from facilities with dangerous chemicals that could be weaponized by terrorists. That in itself is a bit confusing and disturbing. Officials said in a posting on the CISA website that they've alerted participants of the agency's, quote, chemical facility anti-terrorism standards, end quote, program about the hacking and potentially exposed information. This is where it gets interesting from a journalistic standpoint, Ben. The CISA posting about the hacking is very vague. It claims officials have conducted an internal investigation and found no evidence that the hackers stole any actual data. However, at the same time, CISA says there may have been, quote, unauthorized access, end quote, to key information. The agency also has not identified the hackers responsible, but it said the breach involved technology from the Utah-based software company Ivanti, or that the vector for the hack, the way the hackers got in, specifically a remote access virtual private network VPN product called Ivanti Connect Secure. This has led some to conclude that the hackers were likely linked to China. The reason for that is that another company, Mandiant, a cybersecurity firm that's been involved in helping to shape the U.S. government's national cybersecurity program, has previously tied problems with Ivanti Connect Secure to China-linked cyber attackers. If you don't work in cybersecurity or follow all of these terminologies, that may sound like gobbledygook. The bigger eye-opening point here is that CISA, the U.S. federal government's premier anti-hacking agency, got hacked. And that was kept quiet for 6 months. It's going to be very interesting to see whether Congress demands its own investigation to find out what really happened here.
It's embarrassing. I mean, I think that's frankly, it comes down to it, probably the simplest explanation, right? For why you try to keep this thing quiet. I mean, there's potentially obviously national security implications here, but it's also just, if foreign adversaries, want to portray the U.S. as weak and insecure, this certainly.
Well, it's also entirely possible that there are aspects of what went on with the hack that wouldn't revealing those aspects wouldn't necessarily make sense to a news consuming audience, because it's possible that the hack was identified and then allowed to continue. So while I don't have those details, and we're gonna be reporting on it. We're working on it.
Absolutely. It's this story's not going away. That's for sure. And speaking of stories that aren't going away here, Guy, we've talked a fair amount here in the show already in past episodes about the future of war and how small drones, autonomous systems, AI are going to reshape the battles of the future. But one thing that I've been wondering lately is whether the hype has kind of gone a little bit overboard here. Essentially, what I'm wondering is there a drone bubble like we see in financial markets, right? Too much money poured in too quickly, too many eggs in one basket, too many assumptions about the future. And a couple of years from now, the whole thing comes crashing down to some degree. And it's important because right now we're still in the phase where the bubble is inflating. As an example, earlier this month, the Biden administration approved a potential sale of Switchblade 300 attack drones to Taiwan, a sale that could be worth about $60 million. You wonder if China invades in 2026, 2027, 2028, will those drones still be as effective as we are envisioning they will be today? Now, here's what I mean. Earlier this month, French Army Chief of Staff General Pierre Schill told an audience at a defense convention in Paris that the advantages enjoyed by small drones, including those in Ukraine right now, are but, quote, a moment in history, unquote, that will soon be lost. Now, he said that today, about 75% of drones on the battlefield in Ukraine are lost to electronic warfare. He went on to say, quote, the sword in the sense of aerial drones is powerful, more powerful than the shield. The shield is going to grow, unquote. The 75% figure is tough to verify, and some folks dispute that. A lot of the drones we're talking about here are the Switchblade drones made by the firm AeroVironment. And listeners may remember a few weeks ago, we had an interview here on the show with Wahid Nawabi, the CEO of AeroVironment, who talked a lot about how crucial his company's drones have been for the Ukrainian military. And that's true. There's no doubt. Small drones have proven really important in this war. They were also really important in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflicts recently. So drone swarms, they're not going away. But the French general, I think, is right here. Countermeasures are getting better quickly. The Russian electronic warfare systems that can take these things out of the sky have improved significantly over the past 2 years. Here in the U.S., Lockheed Martin last year won a contract with the Army worth tens of millions of dollars to produce a new truck-mounted electronic warfare system. In a nutshell, it's a system that goes on top of a truck or a tank or another vehicle that can disrupt drones using signal jamming, wireless hacking, deceptive signals, and other tactics. So, look, folks inside the defense industry will tell you this is always how it goes, right? There's a capability, somebody figures out how to defeat it, so then the original capability is tweaked, then someone figures out how to beat that, and so on and so forth until the end of time. But Guy, I do wonder if this is an example of something we've discussed recently on the show, and that's a disconnect between the pace of technology and the pace of procurement and fielding in the Pentagon and the State Department and really around the world. I worry that the U.S. and its allies are ending up in a situation where certain capabilities, possibly small drones, simply aren't as useful by the time they actually make it onto the battlefield.
One thing that you said is a bit to unpack there, right? So that question of, is something an offensive capability or is it a defensive capability or is it both? With drones, that can be difficult to nail down. And definitely the issue of U.S. dominance over the global drone landscape, like understanding how that dominance was initially achieved through the American military industrial base's development and production of massive UAVs such as the Reaper drone. It's something I've been following for a while and will continue to follow at threat status. Another thing, actually, Ben, I want to switch to quickly before we get to the interview on this episode is I want to point out that the Biden-Trump debate happened just after, literally an hour after we hit deadline for producing this episode. So we'll be unpacking the national security policy ins and outs and implications from the debate next week on our episode that comes out on July 5. We'll also get into Donald Trump's peace plan to try and end the Ukraine war and create negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, the potential controversy over the plan, as well as the extent to which it could hurt or help Trump return to the White House.
And we are joined now by David Daoud. He is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies who studies Lebanon and Hezbollah. So a very timely guest, of course, to have on the show this week. David, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure being on. Thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. Let's start with this. In Washington this week, Israeli Defense Minister Gallant said that Israel doesn't want a war with Hezbollah, but he said if it comes to that Israel can, quote, send Lebanon back to the Stone Age, unquote. I'm just wondering, is that hyperbole, or would an Israel-Hezbollah war today truly be that devastating and destructive?
I think let's start with the fact that ideally everyone wants to avoid war. I don't think the Israelis are necessarily trying to invite another front, but one has been opened right since October 8th. Hezbollah decided to enter this conflict, opening up a war of attrition alongside Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, its partners in Gaza. And there's been gradual escalation of that conflict in the 8 months since. Alongside the projectiles being fired across both sides of the border, there's been a lot of threat. The threat to send Lebanon back to the Stone Age has been a long-standing one. We heard this in 2006 before the Israelis went to war with Hezbollah. I don't think it's entirely hyperbole this time. Hezbollah is embedded in Lebanon's civilian population, particularly in South Lebanon, in the Bekaa Valley, in South Beirut, in such a way that it was not perhaps almost 2 decades ago when the last war happened. Its arsenal is such today that it would require a massive ground incursion from the Israelis, including overwhelming firepower from the air, from artillery, in order to silence that firepower that would be fired from Hezbollah at Israel. Classical Israeli doctrine requires taking the fight to enemy's territory as quickly as possible. Given the lethality of Hezbollah's arsenal, given the lethality of the assessments of how Hezbollah may open or may attack Israel in those opening rounds, I think we will see the Israelis respond with overwhelming force in a way that we haven't seen in any prior conflict.
From a strategic point of view, David, what do you think Hezbollah actually wants? I've heard mixed opinions from experts over the past few months about whether Hezbollah actually wants a full-blown war with Israel, or if they're content to just kind of let this simmer as it consistently does for the better part of 2 decades now. What do you think? Do they have a goal or a strategy in mind?
If we're talking about the current conflict, they've laid out their strategy. What they want is to divide Israeli attention along 2 fronts, to make the war effort more taxing on the Israeli economy, on the Israeli civilian population, not just them, the broader so-called resistance axis, their partners. There's also pressure on the international community. There's a propaganda war that's going alongside this. All this is meant to slow the Israeli war effort in Gaza to a grind, to where the Israelis can't accomplish their mission ideally against Hamas, where Hamas will be able to survive, rebuild, and attack Israel again. Now that's the immediate strategy for this Al-Aqsa flood or iron swords, depending on who you're asking. But there is a broader strategy. When Hezbollah says they want to destroy Israel, believe them. Now, this isn't destruction that's going to occur in a comical fashion or in some kind of caricatured fashion. They, in their more sober moments, their leadership has acknowledged Israel's military superiority, the conventional power that Israel can bring to bear, and that this isn't something where Hezbollah can, break through the border and bring an end to the Zionist enterprise in one fell swoop. Nasrallah, I believe, acknowledged this even in a 2015 interview with Syrian television, if I'm recalling correctly. Their goal is to bring about Israel's end through a slow erosion process. Now, positioning themselves in this ring of fire that we're seeing develop around Israel in South Lebanon, unifying that front with Syria. This is a process that has been ongoing since the entry of the resistance axis into Syria, since the Syrian civil war, developing that as kind of the strategic depth of Hezbollah in Lebanon and the other resistance axis factions. Gaza plays a central role, and a potential Iranian nuclear weapons capability also plays a central role. And the way I see this playing out is, these forces, once they're in place, around Israel in this ring of fire once their domestic situations are such to where they can absorb the pain of an Israeli military retaliation. They open up with perhaps an October 7th style attack on one or several fronts. The Israelis respond in a way that we've seen since October 7th vis-a-vis Hamas to say, okay, well, you've crossed the line. You as an organization can no longer exist. And at that moment, Iran, if it has this nuclear umbrella, can rattle the nuclear saber. And this doesn't necessarily mean the Iranians are going to strike Israel with a nuclear weapon, but if we're being realistic, Israel does not have a second strike capability. It has the perhaps the nuclear arsenal for it. One single Iranian nuke in Gush Dan in central Israel, Tel Aviv area, would put an end to Israel as we know it as a state. Israel could empty its entire nuclear arsenal in retaliation, and there would be no Israel for which to fight.
David, it's Guy. One, it seems like you're saying an Israel-Hezbollah war is inevitable. And then two, if that's the case, what about the other regional implications and regional response? Do you think that the Arab world and Turkey will line up behind Hezbollah against Israel the way that they have to a degree behind Hamas, at least in terms of propaganda, given that Hezbollah is a Shiite organization and more clearly backed by Iran, at least seemingly so? Or is there a chance that Arab monarchies, I'm specifically talking about Saudi Arabia, might actually tacitly support Israel against Hezbollah?
Let's start with the first part of the question. Yes, I think the war is inevitable. And if it's not going to happen today, it's going to happen in the future. And this is because Hezbollah's enmity towards Israel is not conditional, unless you view Israel's existence as a condition. And what I mean by this is that there's an ideological basis to this. Hezbollah is at its core anti-Judaic. This stems from classical clash between Islam and its parent religion, Judaism, and this has been exaggerated in Hezbollah's ideology. And then you have this especially hated group in Hezbollah's worldview, the Jews, establishing a sovereign state in what Hezbollah considered to be sacred Islamic and stolen Arab land. So there's a double offense that Israel commits. There's also, I mean, in some ways, a triple offense because Hezbollah, as part of this broader resistance axis led by Iran, views itself as in a clash of civilizations with the broader West led by the United States. But Israel, in Hezbollah's conception, is the tip of this spear. It is America's forward military base. It is a tool in Hezbollah's conception. So in order to achieve this goal of eroding and removing Western, but particularly American influence in the region, you have to get rid of Israel. Now, if that conflict comes, I think Arab states would find themselves in a very complicated position. If we go back to 2006, the Saudis, if I'm not mistaken, also the Egyptians and the Jordanians were tacitly supporting the Israelis. I don't think Arab countries can be seen to be explicitly siding with Israel, even in a war that they view as necessary for their safety, if not their future survival.
I actually agree with your assessment about 2006. I was actually in Beirut in 2006. I think the Saudis definitely wanted to influence Lebanese politics at that time away from a Hezbollah political takeover. Of course, that has kind of backfired, and we saw that with the Saad Hariri affair years afterwards. Of course, Saad Hariri is the son of Rafiq Hariri, who was assassinated in Beirut during the lead up to the 2006 war. It's interesting. I remember going to outside of the St. George's Hotel at that time where Rafiq Hariri was killed in a car bomb, and the Hezbollah, I don't think ever claimed responsibility. However, I remember standing and looking at the bomb crater more than a year after the bombing. It was still there, this iconic hotel in Beirut, and looking up, and in the distance, Hezbollah had actually erected a large billboard of Hassan Nasrallah, almost as if he was looking over the crater. This optic was almost surreal. Let's help us get acquainted with Hassan Nasrallah, the longtime head of Hezbollah. We actually read a New York Times piece from 2006, right around the time that Hamas took control of Gaza, that quoted an Arab official calling Nasrallah, quote, the most powerful man in the Middle East. What is the extent of his power and influence today?
It's hard to assess. Look, he's a very charismatic figure. He has been the 30 plus year Secretary General of Hezbollah. I think it was 1993 when he was appointed to his position, and this was not meant to be a permanent position, but his popularity was such that Hezbollah changed its bylaws to keep him there permanently, and he does have an influence on the average supporter of Hezbollah that is akin to a movie star, or a rock star. I remember this during one of my visits to Lebanon in 2010. I believe I was sitting in Costa Cafe in Tyre with a Shiite acquaintance that I'd made, a young woman who was not particularly religious herself, but was part of this broader support network of the resistance axis, sympathized with Hezbollah, and we're sitting and watching him give one of his speeches, watching the same speech, and our reactions could not be more different, where I felt there was this fawning and she couldn't help herself talking about how he pronounces the letter R, even, something that simple. And he knows how to play that. When you watch his speeches, he knows how to speak eloquent Lebanese, or sorry, Arabic Fusha, right? The classical Arabic. And then he knows when to drop into that southern Lebanese drawl go into colloquial Lebanese. He knows how to relate to his audience. I find myself, sometimes yelling at the TV screen when I'm listening to him, because he has that impact. And so he's able to mobilize the emotions of Hezbollah support street in a way that I think no one else can.
I was going to add, I'm glad you mentioned that, because with Iranian elections, of course, happening this week, I was going to ask if that's going to impact Hezbollah and Nasrallah specifically. I mean, I guess from Iran's point of view, whoever the next president ends up being, how important do they see Hezbollah in this broader axis of resistance in the Middle East?
So look, the identity of the president is not going to impact that. The decisions on war and peace in Iran's posture and the posture of its extensions, like Hezbollah, ultimately rest with the supreme leader in the IRGC. As far as Hezbollah's importance, this is the tip of Iran's spear. This is every time Iran has entered into a country, be it Lebanon itself, their influence in Lebanon, right? Part of the genius of the Iranian model is, rather than have an intelligence apparatus in a country which has limitations on how it can understand a country and its specific dynamics, you have local. And that way they can have influence within the political system. Then you go to Iraq in 2003, again, Hezbollah was there first. Syria, 2011, Hezbollah was there first. Palestinian territories, relationships with the Palestinian faction. This also went through Hezbollah, Yemen, and so on and so forth. To the extent that Hezbollah is the tip of Iran's spear, it is what opens up these countries. It is the Arab face of Iranian expansionism. This is critical to Iran's regional project. Without Hezbollah, or if there were damage to Hezbollah, Iran's regional project, Iran's projection power in the region would be significantly damaged.
David, just briefly here before we wrap up, I wanted to ask where, you think Israel, broadly speaking, is on this idea of a full-blown war. This has obviously been a very, taxing, 9 months since the October 7th Hamas attacks. Is the IDF, logistically ready for a full-blown war? Is their morale such to be ready for a full-blown war with Hezbollah? Is the public, would a majority of Israelis support a full-blown war against Hezbollah? Where is Israel, broadly speaking, on that question right now?
We could spend a whole episode talking about just that. Look, I think for the first time in Israel's conflict with Hezbollah, there is an alignment between the public sentiment and understanding of the Hezbollah threat, the military echelon's understanding of the Hezbollah threat, and the political echelon's understanding of the Hezbollah threat that you didn't have in prior conflicts. In 85 to 2000, the Israeli public did not think that destroying Hezbollah was worth the price, comparatively minimal, what would be paid now, was not worth that price. And so you had Hezbollah, or the Israeli army, pulling its punches, and it allowed Hezbollah to survive and claim victory in May of 2000. I think between October 7th, the idea that deceptive quiet across the border is not real quiet at all. It is a Damocles sword. And Hezbollah's entry into the fight shortly after October 7th, and the fact that, if for being honest, the October 7th plan, this was designed in Lebanon. Right? This is a Hezbollah design. They've been calling this the liberation of the Galilee, and how it would have unfolded is exactly like October 7th unfolded from the south. All of this together has created a perception in Israel at least on the public level, that Hezbollah can't be tolerated. Its existence can't be tolerated. So something has to be done to solve this problem. Now, ideally, I think the Israelis would prefer a peaceful solution, that one of these ceasefire proposals would actually deal with the core or the root of Hezbollah's conflict with Israel. I don't see that happening. It seems like war is the likelier option, especially to be able to allow 60,000, 80,000 Israelis to return to their home. Is Israel militarily ready? Look, I think Rafah has to be wrapped up first. The army probably needs some time to rearm and soldiers get some rest and reorient itself towards the war in the north. Plans have to be set, and I think the daylight between the United States and Israel has to be bridged, and that is a critical point because Israel, as much as its doctrine emphasizes defending itself by itself, it needs diplomatic support from the United States to prevent the premature ceasefire. UN Security Council, international sanctions from the international community on Israel, international legitimacy. All of this starts in Washington. And it needs resupply of arms. This is not going to be a short fight. This is going to be a slug, as these types of wars are against non-state actors or irregular forces. This is not going to be the lightning victory of the Six-Day War, even though those forces, fought Israel on multiple fronts. They were technically more powerful than Hezbollah. By the nature of this conflict, it's going to be a slog. So Israel needs time and it needs weapons.
Well, daylight between the U.S. and Israel. Speaking of things that we could dedicate an entire episode to, that's for sure. We'll save that one for another day. David Daoud, thank you so much for joining us here on the show. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure was all mine.
Thanks, David.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week. It's our weekly segment here on the show where Guy and I each identify a threat that we think is affecting U.S. national security right now. This week, as you are listening to the show, Guy, my threat of the week is instability in the tech world, and specifically at artificial intelligence companies. Our colleague Ryan Lovelace had a great story recently about the departure of OpenAI co-founder Ilya Sutskever from the company. OpenAI is, of course, known for its chat GPT technology, which I think we're all pretty familiar with at this point. But while at OpenAI, Sutskever warned about the potential for AI to essentially go rogue and spark the end of humanity as we know it. And a group of former employees from OpenAI and Google DeepMind also recently wrote an open letter about the dangers of the same technology. Last year, the New York Times had a fascinating interview with Jeffrey Hinton, who quit his job at Google, where he was a pioneer in AI research, to speak openly about the technology. He told the Times that a part of him regrets his life's work because, quote, it's hard to see how you can prevent the bad actors from using it for bad things, unquote, referring to artificial intelligence. There's other examples of people resigning from high-profile positions, seemingly because they're worried or, in some cases, apparently even horrified after seeing the destructive potential of what they're working on. Where does that leave the companies themselves? Now, there's a pretty deep bench, of course, in the tech world of people who want to work on this technology. So there's not going to be a shortage of people. But I think if we end up with routine resignations, public warnings, open letters constantly talking about how these companies aren't being honest with the public, or if they're nurturing some potentially really dangerous applications of AI behind the scenes that nobody knows about, well, that sounds like it could be pretty chaotic. And it also wouldn't exactly engender public trust in a technology that I think a lot of people are already pretty worried about. So, Guy, to me right now, it's a threat because we're at a crucial moment in AI development. And I worry that if there's instability in this sector, high profile public instability in this sector, that's just going to fuel more public fear and mistrust going forward.
Definitely, Ben. The whole study of the psychology or mass psychology in response to the emergence of AI is very new, I think, and trying to answer those questions is a little bit difficult. My own threat of the week this week, Ben, is the issue of denial within the U.S. government about how prepared or unprepared the most sophisticated cyber agencies are for a potentially massive cyber attack that could cripple government systems. I'm hot on this right now because of the revelation that CISA itself was hacked, but also because I had dinner the other night with Jacqueline Schneider, a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University who has spent years working on a range of tech issues. She's an expert on AI, wargaming, but also an expert on cyber threats. And one of the things we discussed is that her research has found that Americans don't think cyber attacks could lead to real kinetic wars. I'm summarizing, of course. Jacqueline Schneider basically said common Americans have a blasé attitude toward cybersecurity, and that attitude permeates up to the highest levels of the U.S. government's cybersecurity agencies. My thread of the week is that of denial within the U.S. government about how prepared the government is for a major cyber attack.
Yeah, no, that's something to say that we are going to be keeping a close eye on that here in the Threat Status podcast would be an understatement. So thank you for that, Guy. Thank you to David Daoud for joining us from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies to talk about Hezbollah. Fascinating conversation. And thank you all for listening. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, tell your friends, and Guy and I will be back next week here on the Threat Status podcast.